The summer of 1887 was a crucible, a relentless hammer of sun that baked the high desert of the Nevada Territory into a cracked canvas of rust and ochre. The railroad, a scar of progress that had sliced through the wilderness years before, had left its own human debris scattered across the unforgiving land. It was here, in a valley shadowed by jagged, sun-scorched peaks, that Ben Thorne worked his solitary ranch. He was a man more accustomed to the silent language of cattle and the moods of the sky than the company of people. His hands, thick with calluses, were instruments of labor, not conversation. A veteran of the war between the states, Ben had come west seeking a silence loud enough to drown out the ghosts of Shiloh, but found only a different kind of conflict etched into the land itself. His personal war was with the valley's self-appointed king, Barrett Kane, a land baron whose greed was as vast as the territory he coveted. Kane wanted Ben's water rights, the lifeblood of his modest cattle operation, and he was not a man accustomed to being denied. The tension was a dry, waiting heat, promising a wildfire with the first stray spark. That spark arrived one blistering afternoon in the form of a woman, collapsed near his well, her traditional silk clothing torn and stained with the dust of a long and desperate journey. She was Chinese, a face that in the nearby town of Redemption was either invisible or a target for scorn. Her name was Mai Lin. She had escaped a life of indentured servitude in one of Redemption's shadowy back rooms, a gilded cage where she was meant to be an ornament until her spirit broke. But Mai Lin's spirit was forged of a finer, stronger steel. Ben, finding her, was moved not by compassion but by a grudging pragmatism. He saw not a woman, but a potential pair of hands. His last ranch hand had been run off by Kane's men weeks prior, and the work was piling up. He carried her limp form to his sparse cabin, his touch rough but efficient. When she awoke, he offered her not comfort, but a deal, spoken in the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who weighs every word. A bowl of stew, a roof over her head, and protection from the men who would surely be looking for her. In exchange, she would work. Mai Lin, her gaze sharp and intelligent despite her exhaustion, saw the hardness in his eyes. She also saw the solitude that mirrored her own. She agreed with a single, sharp nod. The cultural chasm between them was a palpable, screaming silence. Mai Lin, raised in a world of subtle gestures, ancient poetry, and rigid social hierarchies, saw Ben as a barbarian. He was a giant of a man, his movements broad and unrefined, his way of life stripped to the bone of raw survival. She watched him work, his sheer physical power unsettling and strangely compelling. He was a creature of this wild, untamed land, as much a part of it as the hawks that circled overhead. In the quiet evenings, she would mend her clothes by the firelight, her thoughts a world away, a torrent of disdain and reluctant fascination. The dust here, she thought, is the color of old sorrow. This American, this rancher, he manages his life like a cattle pen. He speaks in grunts and his movements are heavy, deliberate, like the great stupid bulls he herds. He does not understand nuance. He does not understand tradition. His eyes, when they look at me, are merely the eyes of a foreman assessing a workhorse. We are a foreign body on his land, a curiosity he must contain. Yet he needs my hands to pull his pitiful crop of beans from the soil. He thinks necessity is a contract. Does he truly believe his coarse, lonely way of life can ever tame a spirit forged in the heart of the celestial empire? Ben Thorne was equally perplexed. Mai Lin was not the meek, subservient creature described in the racist broadsheets that circulated in Redemption. She was resilient, organized, and possessed a quiet, unyielding dignity that unnerved him. She worked the small vegetable garden with a chilling, synchronized efficiency, her movements a kind of silent, fluid poetry. She was terrified, he could see that in the way she held herself, but her back was impossibly straight. The tension was about to break. Barrett Kane and his men, seeing Mai Lin's presence on the Thorne Ranch as a personal affront and a convenient excuse, began to escalate their campaign of harassment. A critical section of the irrigation ditch that fed Ben's main pasture had been deliberately collapsed overnight, a slow act of strangulation designed to choke his ranch to death. Ben knew a formal complaint to the bought and paid for sheriff in Redemption was useless. It would only tighten Kane's grip. He had to fix it himself, and he had to do it fast. He decided to appeal to a shared, primal instinct, survival. He needed to prove to My Lin that the task at hand was not just for his benefit, but for theirs, a shared responsibility in this desolate outpost. The ditch is broken, he told her the next morning, his voice flat. We fix it today, or the cattle die tomorrow. It's hard work. Dangerous. Kane's men will be watching, and My Lin looked him in the eye, her gaze a steel needle. And what guarantee do I have of my safety, Mr. Thorne? We are surrounded by men who hate me for my face and you for your land. Ben didn't flinch. I'll tell you this, Miss Lin. This land doesn't care what language you speak or where you were born. It only cares about the hands that work it. If they try to harm you, they'll answer to me. He paused, the silence hanging heavy between them. He had made a promise, and in doing so, had woven their fates together. How he could protect her from the venom of a community that saw her as less than human, he did not know. He only knew he had to. The work was brutal, back-breaking labor under the unforgiving sun. They moved earth and rock, their movement slowly falling into a shared rhythm born of necessity. Ben, with his raw strength, shifted boulders that seemed immovable. My Lin, with her surprising stamina and intelligent approach, cleared the smaller debris with a relentless, focused energy. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels against stone and their own ragged breaths. Ben watched her from the corner of his eye. He had expected her to falter, to complain, to break. She did none of those things. Her face, smudged with dirt, was a mask of fierce concentration. Around midday, the sun reached its zenith, turning the air into a shimmering mirage. My Lin, leveraging a large rock with a length of wood, slipped. The rock rolled, pinning her hand against another, and she let out a sharp, involuntary cry of pain. Instinctively, Ben was at her side in 2 long strides, his usual deliberate pace abandoned. He expected hysterics, but her face was pale and composed, though her eyes were wide with shock and pain. He moved the rock with a single, powerful heave. Her hand was scraped raw and bleeding. He looked at the wound, then at her, and for a moment, the chasm between them vanished. He saw not a Chinese worker but a woman in pain. He tore a strip of cloth from his own worn shirt. He didn't offer it to her. Instead, he uncorked his canteen, poured a small stream of precious water onto the makeshift bandage, and with a touch that was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size, he carefully cleaned the grit from her wound. He then wrapped her hand with a firm, practiced efficiency. This act, a mixture of raw frontier practicality and an unexpected, unspoken tenderness, shattered My Lin's perception of him. She had prepared for brutality, for gruff commands, for the cold dehumanization of their arrangement. She was not prepared for this human moment of shared vulnerability under a sun that did not recognize empires or borders. Recovering, she bowed her head slightly, a gesture of profound, ingrained respect that was entirely lost on him. Ben simply grunted, pointed to the shade of a lone juniper tree. Rest. My Lin, however, saw the complexity of the larger threat. As she sat, nursing her hand, she noticed a faint but unmistakable signal. A rider on the ridge, one of Kane's men, silhouetted against the sky. He wasn't attacking. He was watching, reporting. The local community, stoked by Kane's whispers, was observing their every move. The fragile bond built by a single strip of cloth could be violently undone by one greedy, ruthless man. My Lin stood, returned to her work with a renewed fervor, but her eyes kept darting to the ridge. She realized that their survival depended not on their ability to resist brute force, but on their ability to understand and navigate the fierce, hidden currents of this land and the passions of its people. That evening, as they shared a silent meal in the cabin, Ben spoke, his voice low. You did good work today. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment. My Lin simply nodded, her gaze lingering on his large, rough hands, the same hands that had been so gentle. She understood now that the threat was not just from the man who owned the valley, but from the slow, insidious way this shared struggle was eroding the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. The real battle was not for water, but for the soul of the survivor. Could she maintain the purity of her own code, her own identity, now that the barbarian had shown her a face of unexpected compassion? The fragile truce forged by shared labor and a strip of cloth was shattered not by Kane's men, but by a sudden, devastating act of nature. Mid-August brought the dreaded high desert monsoon, a violent assault that descended with the destructive power of an artillery barrage. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and within minutes, a flash flood was roaring down the dry creek bed, transforming it into a raging torrent. The newly repaired irrigation ditch, their entire day of grueling work, was instantly obliterated, the churning, muddy water tearing through the land with impartial fury. Ben, caught checking the fence line near the creek, was immediately galvanized. His first instinct was not for himself, but for his horses, trapped in the lower corral. He sprinted toward the barn, the roar of the flood a physical blow against his ears. The horses were his life, his capital. They were everything. My Lin, watching from the cabin door, saw this raw, instinctual priority. The value placed on livestock over all else was a chilling, alien equation of the American West. When the storm passed as quickly as it came, the damage was catastrophic. The flood had not only destroyed the ditch but had also washed out the main access road, isolating the ranch completely. Worse, it had severely damaged the foundation of the barn, where Ben stored his meager winter supplies. The small patch of land they had worked so hard to save was now a ruin of mud and debris. At that moment, Barrett Kane and two of his hired guns chose to appear on the ridge, their rifles held casually but purposefully. The flood, for them, was not a disaster but an opportunity. They saw Ben's ruin as a sign of weakness, the perfect time to press their advantage. Kane's voice, carried on the damp air, was slick with false sympathy. "Looks like you've had some trouble, Thorn. Maybe God himself is telling you this land ain't meant for you. Or for your kind of company." He spat on the ground, his eyes fixed on My Lin, who now stood beside Ben. Ben's hand drifted toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He was a rancher first, but he had been a soldier for full long years. He understood the venom of a bully. "This is my land, Kane. You're not welcome here. Ride on before you get hurt." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This ain't about welcome, Thorn. This is about business. I'll give you $500 for this whole mud pit. Take it, and you and your little China doll can be on the next train out of here. Refuse, well, accidents happen in a place this wild." Ben didn't argue. He knew words were useless. This was a confrontation that could only end one way. He needed to get My Lin to safety, but they were trapped. He slowly began to walk toward the cabin, his movements calm and measured, trying to position himself between Kane and My Lin. It was a strategy of forced, dangerous retreat. Inside the cabin, the tension was an almost physical presence. The world outside had shrunk to three menacing figures on a ridge. "You need to hide," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "In the root cellar. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." My Lin met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not fear, but a cold, calculated fury. "They do this because of me," she stated, her voice trembling with a rage she had kept buried for months. "This is not your fight alone." Before Ben could reply, a shot rang out, splintering the wood of the doorframe. The siege had begun. As dusk began to fall, turning the muddy landscape into a morass of shifting shadows, a stray spark from one of Kane's rifles, likely intended to intimidate, landed on the oil-soaked rags near the damaged barn foundation. The dry timber, stressed by the flood, caught fire instantly. A visceral cry of rage erupted, not from Kane but from Ben, as he saw the licking flames begin to consume his future. He reacted instantly, his survival instincts taking over. He grabbed a bucket, yelling at My Lin to get to the well, knowing that a direct confrontation with Kane's men while his livelihood burned was suicide. But My Lin ran not toward the well, but toward the fire. The men on the ridge froze, believing this was a moment of insane panic. But My Lin didn't scream. She grabbed a heavy horse blanket, soaked it in a rain barrel Ben had forgotten, and with a surprising agility, scrambled onto the low roof of the attached lean-to. She began beating at the flames, her small frame a study in desperate, focused action. Ben, seeing this spontaneous, courageous act, understood instantly what she was doing. She was creating a diversion, drawing their fire, buying him precious seconds. He used that time not to fight the fire, but to act. He burst from the back of the cabin, circling around through the deepening gloom. He was no longer a rancher defending his land, he was a soldier, flanking the enemy. Kane, arriving at the scene, saw not a cowering farmer, but a small Chinese woman fighting to save his barn and the rancher himself moving like a phantom through the shadows. The rifle wavered. The silent, calculated violence of his plan had been replaced by the noisy, desperate drama of fire and survival. Ben closed the distance. The first of Kane's men went down with a single, brutal blow from the butt of his rifle. The second, startled, fired widely before Ben disarmed him. Kane, seeing the tables turn so suddenly, aimed his rifle at Mai Lin on the roof. But in that instant, she threw the heavy, smoking blanket down directly onto him. Blinded and tangled, he stumbled back as Ben slammed into him, the fight draining from the land baron in a rush of shock and pain. The crisis was averted. Ben stood over the defeated men, breathing heavily. He looked from the smoldering barn to Mai Lin, whose face was streaked with soot and exhaustion, her hands burned from the hot blanket. That night, with Kane and his men tied up in the storm cellar, they stood in the quiet of the cabin. The hatred from outside had been met and defeated. The shared necessity had become a shared battle. Mai Lin looked at the man before her. He was not a barbarian. He was a protector. He saw her not as a workhorse, but as a warrior. The land here demanded a singular, brutal loyalty, and in that crucible of fire and flood, they had forged an alliance that transcended race, language, and the ghosts of their pasts. But as the adrenaline faded, a different kind of tension filled the small cabin, a charge that was both terrifying and inevitable. The deeper, unspoken price of their accidental, forbidden collaboration was about to be paid. The silence that descended upon the Thorn Ranch after the failed attack was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. With Kane and his men bound in the cellar, the immediate threat was contained, but the cabin itself seemed to shrink, charged with an unspoken energy. The world had been reduced to two people, the smell of rain-soaked earth and smoke, and the flickering light of a single lantern. Ben Thorn, the solitary rancher, and Mai Lin, the escaped servant, stood facing each other, stripped of their roles, their pasts, their defenses. They were simply a man and a woman who had fought together, who had saved each other. Ben tended to the burns on Mai Lin's hands, his touch as rough and gentle as it had been by the ditch. This time, however, his fingers lingered. Her skin was soft beneath the grime and soot. He looked up, and his gaze met hers. The carefully constructed walls between them crumbled into dust. All the disdain, the fear, the cultural chasms, they were meaningless now, artifacts of a world that had burned away with the corner of his barn. In her eyes, he saw not a fragile refugee, but a reflection of his own fierce will to survive, a strength he hadn't realized he was so desperate to find. Mai Lin watched the play of lantern light on his rugged face, tracing the lines of exhaustion and the deeper lines of old sorrows. She had seen him as a creature of brute force, a barbarian of the West. But she had also seen him sacrifice his body to fix a ditch, gently tend her wound, and move like a vengeful spirit to protect her. The arousal that bloomed within her was a shocking, terrifying thing, a response not just to his raw masculine presence, but to the unshakable core of honor she had discovered within him. It was a forbidden, dangerous feeling, a betrayal of everything she had been, yet it was the most honest thing she had felt since setting foot on this hostile continent. He finished wrapping her hands and didn't let go. His thumb stroked the inside of her wrist, a simple, questioning gesture that sent a tremor through her. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. The distant howl of a coyote was the only sound. "Mai Lin," he said, his voice a low rasp, speaking her name as if for the first time. It was not a command, not a statement, but a surrender. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned in, a silent answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. The touch was electric, a collision of two worlds, two solitudes. His calloused hands, which knew only the harshness of rope and wood and steel, were now impossibly tender as they cupped her face. Her own hands, small and burned, came up to rest on his powerful chest. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry confirmation of life in the face of death, a raw claiming of a solace they had both been denied for too long. It was the taste of dust and rain and survival. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the simple cot in the corner of the room, the one sanctuary in his Spartan world. The rough wool blanket scratched against her skin as he laid her down. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the log walls, turning the small cabin into a sacred, secret world. As his hands began to explore the unfamiliar ties of her silk clothing, a lifetime of rigid propriety warred with a sudden, overwhelming wave of desire. A flicker of fear, of doubt, crossed her face. He paused, his eyes searching hers, giving her a final chance to retreat. But then she thought of the cage she had escaped, the leering faces in redemption, the cold and lonely desperation of her flight. And she thought of this man, this quiet, violent, gentle man who had offered her not pity, but a chance to fight. He was her only ally, her only anchor in this mad, wild country. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, and pulled him down to her. "Please," she whispered, the single word a dam breaking, unleashing all the pent-up loneliness and longing. "Don't stop." Their union was as fierce and elemental as the storm that had brought them to this moment. It was a frantic, desperate search for warmth in a cold world, a furious act of defiance against the forces that sought to tear them apart. For Ben, it was a release from the ghosts that haunted him, a searing, present-moment reality that burned away the past. For Mai Lin, it was a reclamation of her own body, her own choices, an act not of submission, but of powerful, active desire. In the heart of the desolate American West, a lone rancher and a fugitive Chinese woman found in each other's arms not just passion, but a profound and savage grace. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp, and the rising sun cast a golden light over the ravaged land. They turned Kane and his men over to a traveling marshal, providing a carefully edited version of events that painted Kane as a simple trespasser and arsonist. The truth of the battle, and the truth of what happened after, remained their own secret treaty, sealed in the quiet of the cabin. Ben Thorne rebuilt his barn, stronger this time. The ranch, once a place of solitary struggle, became a shared fortress. Mai Lin, no longer a servant or a refugee, became his partner, her intelligence and resilience as vital to their survival as his strength. She would often walk the land with him, their hands intertwined, a silent testament to the strange moral compromises forced by survival, and the unexpected courage found outside the boundaries of convention. They were two different worlds that had collided in violence and necessity, forging a new world in the process, a legacy built not of blood or birthright, but of shared survival and a love as fierce and untamed as the land itself.